Hello, everybody. Shrikant, thank you so much for inviting me to make this presentation. I think what you do with your meetup group is magical, and it's an honor to be part of your over 1,000 meetups that you've done. And I'd like to welcome all of you here, and thank you for your interest in Carl Jung and Marie-Louise Von Franz. I think we're going to go on an interesting journey this evening. And I'd just like to say that this presentation will be about 30 minutes, and then we'll have the opportunity to take your questions or hear your comments and have a great discussion. So I look forward to that. I'm going to ask you to pretend that we're just together one-on-one. Whoever's at this meetup, whoever's watching this video. Just imagine yourself in the room with me, and we're going to go on a journey together. This room's in a wonderful house on a hilltop. It's got a magnificent view of the ocean, and it's pretty foggy outside. So it's very mythical and mystical. So we're going to go on a journey together. And on this journey, I'm just going to ask you to relax. I know it's very tough, trust me, to put away what's going on the inside and the outside. But let's just relax together, take a breath, and be open to what I'm about to tell you. I'm going to be asking you to answer a very profound question. Now, when you see it in the beginning of the presentation, I don't want you to try and answer it. Don't even think about it. On the journey, you'll get a lot of information and definitions and context. We're just going to go on this together, being relaxed and being open. And we're going to go into some of the inner depths of our psyche. We're going to go to the very center. And I think we're going to discover and see something that I think is awesome. It's something that people over history say, well, it's a secret knowledge or it's a hidden knowledge. I think it's knowledge that's just not known. So let's go on this journey together. So I'm going to share my screen. And can you see this okay?
Yes.
Okay. So here's the question. And remember what I said. Don't really think about this question. But the question is, are you a Puer Aeternus? Or are you a conscious hero? This journey is my journey. And Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, taught me to think that I was on a hero's journey, which I love. So we're on this hero's journey together. And where we are right now is where I was in my early 30s. I was in a very dark place. Psychologically, physically, professionally, it was all a mess. I was in the dark forest, the wasteland, the underworld. I had no idea what the path forward was. I was lost. And I know you and many other people can get to this place. I also know that societies and cultures can get to this place. So to comfort myself, I would go to my cousin's small apartment and just sit there and be around him and look at his bookshelves. He had a great book collection. And one night, I walked up to the bookshelf and I saw this book. I had no idea what this meant. I was, however, intrigued by this picture. So I turned the book around and it said, the author Marie-Louise Von Franz worked directly with C.J. Jung for nearly 30 years. Now I knew who Carl Jung was. I knew nothing about Marie-Louise Von Franz. And I really didn't know that much about Jung, but I continued. I read on. Well, here's our definition. Puer Aeternus, eternal child, is Von Franz's classic study of the youth within us. Resistant to commitment in work and relationships, and unable to completely abandon the dreams and fantasies of adolescence. And this next paragraph shook me to my core. Von Franz shows how this childhood innocence can thwart our self-actualization and doom us to adolescent delusions and provisional living. I didn't know what self-actualization meant, but these words doom and delusions, something inside me really got stirred up. And what did she mean by this phrase, provisional living? Well, Jung says the provisional life, where one does not exist really, they are only a spectator, so any experience is ghost-like, perfectly abstract, without a trace of realization. What did he mean by without a trace of realization? What are we supposed to realize? Now, looking back now, I understand what he meant, but back then, I had no idea. It just was stirring me up. What provisional life, realization, what's happening? So I opened the book and Von Franz started to describe a puer. Puer has a constant inner refusal to commit oneself to the moment. One has no need to adapt, for that would be impossible for such a hidden genius. An arrogant attitude arises towards other people due to both an inferiority complex and false feelings of superiority. A secret thought that one day one will be able to save the world. Well, I'm not going to tell you all the characteristics back then I fulfilled, but I was definitely a puer. I was sort of shocked. Boy, she's really describing a lot of parts of myself. So she said, in order to get into the deeper background of the whole problem, I want to first interpret the Little Prince. This really threw me for a loop. I don't know what I was expecting in this book, some sort of very psychiatric, medical, textbook sounding thing. Why is she talking about the Little Prince? I love the Little Prince. Where are we going with this? I had no idea. I love the author of The Little Prince, Anton de Saint-Exupery. He was a very romantic and dashing figure. He was French. He was a pilot who flew airmail routes in Europe, Africa, and South America. In 1935, he and his mechanic crashed in the Libyan desert, and they barely survived. That experience had a great influence on him as he created The Little Prince, which he wrote in 1942 in New York. In 1944, during World War II, when he was 44 years old, he disappeared on a reconnaissance mission over the Mediterranean. He was a celebrity. This was international news. The Little Prince sold an estimated 140 million copies worldwide, which makes it one of the best-selling in history. The book has been translated into over 505 different languages and dialects worldwide, being the second most translated work ever published, trailing only the Bible. This was an extremely popular work that she was tackling. So what does she say about the Little Prince? And I quickly realized she wasn't really talking about the character of the Little Prince. She was talking about the character of who wrote the Little Prince, which I was fascinated by. Because usually when I read books, I really didn't think that much about the authors. I mean, I sort of knew their reputation. Oh, I like the books by them. But she was focusing on how the Little Prince represented the personality of the author. She'd started off by saying, a very cold, brutal man somewhere in the background. I'm like, whoa, what? He believes that his childhood life is the true life. He has not found a bridge which could take over what we would call the true life into the adult life. Like, wow, pretty harsh. She continued, he speaks mockingly of the grown-up world and grown-up people. The Puer refuses to accept reality as it is. His attitude is a form of egotism, of narcissism. I was pretty taken aback. What did she say about the Little Prince and his relationship with his rose? He gives away the fact that he was not up to the vanity and mood as well as the charm and beauty of the rose. The moodiness and all the difficulties with the haughty princess in this rose drove him from the planet. The rose is a bit sad when he leaves. An absolutely perfect description of a lover's relationship where each tortures the other. Both suffer in their inner hearts and are too proud to make a gesture of conciliation or don't know how to. How does she know all this from reading The Little Prince? Well, when you go through Puer Aeternus, it's stunning. She's using terms in a language I had not heard before. Archetypes, wrong ego attitude, the self, infantile shadow, mother complex. What did this all mean? How did she know this? It's like she had X-ray vision into the psyche of the author. I really wanted to know what this all meant. And what was Jung talking about, what we're supposed to realize? I did not have the pieces of the puzzle together. But I decided, like Neo in the Matrix, I wanted to know the truth. What was happening in reality? Who was I? So I took the red pill. And the red pill meant going down the rabbit hole where you first meet the wizard himself, Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology. Carl Jung has had the greatest intellectual influence on my life, by far. He's not the only person to have shaped my worldview or what I believe, but he has made a tremendous contribution. Is Carl Jung perfect? Of course not. I urge everyone to read the good, the bad, and the ugly about Carl Jung. All of it is fascinating. And if you decide, well, he's too hard to read, or I'm know he's done some bad things. I'm not going to deal with it. I have to tell you, that is a major life mistake. Eventually, Carl Jung will be up there with the influence that a Charles Darwin had on this world. There's a lot I can say about his life, but I just want to hit some major events. And one is his collaboration with Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, of course, the father of psychoanalysis. And Carl Jung saw him as a father figure. And Sigmund Freud saw Carl Jung as his golden boy. They both were incredibly rational, scientific thinkers. And I urge you to study their relationship. There's amazing letters. There's lots of books, some great movies. It's fascinating how these two collaborated. But Carl Jung was very different than Sigmund Freud. Carl Jung had a very spiritual outlook on life that Freud did not share and did not like, because Freud was struggling to make psychology and psychoanalysis palatable to the scientific community. And he really warned Jung that spiritual stuff, they're going to think it's mumbo jumbo. Jung's reaction was he never budged an inch from what he believed. Freud thought the libido was, sexual drive. Jung was thinking of the libido as a sort of psychic, creative drive. And so it created tremendous growing tension between them. And at a certain point, Jung published Psychology of the Unconscious. Well, this was like the final straw for Freud. He's like, you're non grata to me. This book's also known as Symbols of Transformation. This is a modern cover, but I like this cover because you have the archetypal hero and the sword, and you're in sort of a cave and there's a dragon. And I got to tell you, this book is an incredibly hard book to read. It's full of amazing insights, but it's a slog. I didn't read this book because, it was his first major work and it created a schism with Freud. I read this work because I heard an interview with Joseph Campbell, who said that this book, Symbols of Transformation, had a tremendous influence on him and how he thought about mythology. And I remember I went to the library of Pacifica with my cousin Jeff. Pacifica on the West Coast. Why did I go there? Because Joseph Campbell's library was there. I was surprised, but it was there. And I went in there, and I was like an archaeologist. I was like a treasure hunter. I was looking for this book on all the bookshelves, and I found it. I found Joseph Campbell's copy of Jung's Symbols of Transformation. It was like holding the Shroud of Turin for me. I opened the book, and I could see the notes Joseph Campbell took in this book. Profound. After this book was published, Jung was sort of banished from the nascent psychoanalytical community. And around that time, World War I broke out. Major chaos. Chaos around Jung, chaos in his own head. And he retreated to his castle-like home in Switzerland and proceeded to have a major psychological breakdown. Now, to put it in context, Jung did marry one of the richest women in Switzerland. He had a great lake view in the backyard. He still had his practice. He had friends. He volunteered occasionally with the Swiss Army. So it wasn't like he was in the complete fetal position in a cave somewhere. It was Jung style. He had his creature comforts. But it was a major breakdown. And what's fascinating is he documented what was happening to himself. He called it a confrontation with the unconscious. He wrote passages and notes and journals, and he drew funky stuff and paintings. He played with toys on the ground, but he pieced himself back together. And he collected a lot of those notes and what he wrote, and he put it together into something that would eventually be called the Red Book. Now, the Red Book had not come out till 2009. It remained hidden away, and it came out, and I actually went to the UCLA Hammer Museum in 2010 and saw it. So it was up there with holding Joseph Campbell's book. So I'm looking at Jung's Red Book. I knew it was important, but if I thought Psychology of the Unconscious was a hard read, this was incomprehensible. I just wouldn't do it. It was all over the map. I had no idea what was going on, but I did know there was something very important in this book. And I had that thought of that realization that Jung wanted us to have. But I gave up. I just couldn't handle the Red Book. Now, after this time, his confrontation with the unconscious, after he put himself back together, Jung continued to build his international reputation. And some of the richest people in the world would travel to him to be his patients. He was a very prolific writer. He wrote books and journals and letters. He was quite the celebrity. And I look at the pictures of Jung, and I'm finally struck looking back this time around. He had a look on his face as like, I know something. I know something. What? What do you know? Around 1933, Jung meets Marie-Louise Von Franz. She's 18 years old. Marie-Louise Von Franz was born in Munich, and when she was 4, her family moved to Zurich, where she spent most of her life. And she was introduced to Jung, and she needed to make money to put herself through school, so she started translating some of Jung's work. Well, this formed an amazing collaboration for the rest of Jung's life. Because of all his students and his patients and people he met, Jung looked at Von Franz and go, this woman is very, very special. This woman is very important to me. And I could only imagine the discussions they had. It's probably one of the most powerful collaborations in history. Sitting by the lake, walking through the Alps. I have this image that Jung's like this Gandalf Merlin figure with the secrets of nature, giving it to his young disciple, who's very, very, very sharp. Jung's amazing, but like I said, he's a very tough read. Most of the time. There are parts where it really flows. But with Von Franz, it always flows. It's uncanny. It's like how she downloads Jung's information. Amazing. So over the years, I just got everything I could by Jung, by Von Franz about them. This is only a portion of what they did. But look at the title. It's amazing. It's so fascinating, especially Von Franz books about fairy tales. Her books about fairy tales, she takes stories throughout history, and it's like she has this X-ray vision to tell you exactly what the authors, what their psychological needs were, what was missing. Incredibly powerful insight. So I read these books over the years, and finally, I felt I was prepared to go back to the Red Book. Because now I knew what I was looking for. Where before it was incomprehensible, I now had enough clues reading Von Franz of what I was looking for. And I found it. It was unbelievable. It was unbelievable because I understood what he was talking about. This is from the Red Book. It shows someone, probably Jung, on a journey on a pathway. And these are two figures that he called Elijah and Salome. Now, they're very archetypal. You know, think of all the myths and the fairy tales where on the journey you meet the wise old man and the young woman. But this was Carl Jung's version of the archetype. And he wrote, Elijah said to him, "We are real and not symbols." He placed the date on the winter solstice, which sort of makes me laugh. I know Carl Jung's a great storyteller. Who knows if it happened on the solstice? But of course, it happened, you know, the winter solstice in probably at midnight, where he had this revelation. But what was he saying? And he eventually called these symbols the animus and the anima, the spirit and the soul. He was saying in the Red Book, they were speaking to him, autonomous, independent characters, saying the spirit and the soul within you are real. We are not symbols. Now, Carl Jung wasn't someone smoking peyote in a desert who had a vision. This is one of the most rational, scientific minds in human history, the founder of analytic psychology, describing this. And then he shows the dialogue he's having with his own spirit and soul. They say, we certainly are what you call real. Here we are, and you have to accept us. The choice is yours. And here's what's so profound about that. Whether you like it or not, whether you accept it or not, you have almost this divine energy inside you. And this divine energy has a character to it, your spirit and soul. And you need to learn what they are and what they want and how they're trying to communicate with you and how they're trying to guide you. That's really when he's talking about that realization. Now, when I'm using terms like divine and spirit and soul, it sounds very religious, but I'm not looking at it through that lens. I'm looking at it through a psychological lens. How can this help me psychologically heal and be healthy and be happier. Now, Jung talks a lot about the psychological ramifications of what he's talking about here, and I encourage you to read it. It's fascinating. But like I said, I'm just looking at this from a psychological standpoint. And this is awesome to me. I realized eventually that I could become a conscious hero who's helping my spirit and soul. I have a role to play with these characters. I'm just not a spectator. We have a conscious, heroic role to play with our own spirit and our own soul. So now I look back at this book. I'm amazed I found this book when I did. Of all the works of Jung and Von Franz, this book was such a key to unlocking so many mysteries. This book is a wake-up call. This book is a warning. It's not that the little prince, or really the author, are bad people, but what they're saying is, it is bad at a certain point of your life if you really revere these characters. You're stuck if you revere these characters. And then I had a crazy insight. Look at the characters that are so revered in our culture right now, who have a secret thought that one day one will be able to save the world. This is textbook Puer. This is our culture. And it's not just comic book characters. Look at our James Bond. The list goes on of the save the world characters that we find so entertaining. And it's not just entertainment. Think of the celebrities people revere, politicians, business people. And then I had another chilling insight. Are we in a Puer matrix? Like in the movie, the machines created this illusion in our minds, so we didn't understand the nature of reality. Are we just going through life with an illusion in our minds and not knowing the nature of reality? It doesn't mean people aren't loving and they're good people, or they make mistakes, or they're hardworking, or they make great contributions. But are they traveling through life without the trace of realization that Jung's talking about? And Jung's like, hello, that's exactly what's happening. I consider the Puer Aeternus attitude an unavoidable evil. We're all sort of starting out on that pathway. And if we're not educated, we don't know any better. They don't teach Jungian theory in formal education. There's no Jung segment on the nightly news. No one really knows this information. It's out there. There's lots of Jung institutes. There's lots of writings, but it's not mainstream at all. And then Jung says, people in general just fear of the new and unknown. If you bring it up to them, they're like, hey, whatever. In fact, he says, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. This is so true. Think of all the medications people take. Think of all the escapism people do. I'm traveling. I'm going to see this movie. I'm going to stare at my phone. I'm going to be on social media. Think of our hyper-materialism, our worship of technology. Well, the problem is, Jung says it always leads to external blows of fate, which show the need for a new attitude. You're trying to escape, you're going to be slammed left and right by reality checks. It's not going to be a fun journey. And that's just from the outside. From the inside, Jung said, I was in the grip of a daemon. And daemon means divinity, but it also means demonic. And what he's saying is that inner divinity inside you wants to be known. And if you don't know it, it's going to shake you apart. And what happens is it gets so bad for people, they need to check themselves into rehab or go into a recovery program. And what did Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, what did he write to Jung? A certain conversation you had with one of your patients did play a critical role in the founding of our fellowship, because of course Carl Jung's involved in that. There he is again. Because Jung's saying his craving for alcohol was the equivalent, wrote Jung in reply to Wilson, on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness expressed in the medieval language, the union with God. I call it unity with divinity. So there's Jung again saying, if you avoid taking this inner journey and learning about that divine inside, you're on the road to rehab. That's how important it is. So in wrapping up, why did I take the red pill? The greatest fear I have in my life is going through the struggle of life, the brief existence of life, and not knowing what's really going on and who I really am. That terrifies me. So taking the red pill to me was learning from Carl Jung, learning from Marie Von Franz, and so many other people, taking it seriously, years of learning. And that's just the first step. Then you have to incorporate it into your life. And that's very, very, very hard. You might have to change your whole worldview about yourself and the universe. Who's going to do that willingly? And you really have to condition and reprogram yourself. But I'll tell you, that journey is worth it. Because when you learn about the true nature of these divine characters and how you can play a heroic role in helping your spirit and soul, it can give you tremendous psychological health, tremendous psychological wholeness. It could reduce your suffering and expand your loving of being alive. So I'm going to end how I began. I hope you ask yourself this question. Are you a Puer Aeternus, or are you a conscious hero?
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Amazing. Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. I have many questions, but I would like to, get people who are first familiar with Von Franz to make their comments and ask questions. And then we'll open it up for everybody. Muriel, George, Aiden, whoever wants to go ahead and type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom, and we will get the comments and questions. Who would like to go first? Muriel.
Sure. Thank you, David.
Welcome. Nice to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you, and I see some familiar faces. And David, wonderful presentation, not only putting it in a historical context, but also speaking of what I would say a growing urgency that until we collectively, starting individually and then collectively address this, as Marie-Louise Von Franz said, the problem of the Puer Aeternus, then yes, we're going to crash. And so, it's so easy to, to sit in that inflation and say, okay, look what's wrong with our culture, and our culture is so immature, and our our culture is doing everything that Marie-Louise Von Franz defined as the Puer Aeternus, at least the culture in the West. So we should probably clarify that. And but it has to start within. Like, it has to start with confronting that problem in ourselves in order to that's what Jung believed, is that you begin local before you go global. And I think you emphasized that so beautifully. In terms of as you were presenting, I was thinking about how, if we really trace its ontology, we're probably going back to the story of Cain and Abel. Because when Cain's sacrifice, or when his offering to his God was deemed unacceptable and his brother's was lauded, rather than take that as a correction and try to do better, he slayed his brother. And we are heir, and our culture is heir to the sin of Cain. And so there is some sense of we are wired for this. And what it requires is that whole idea of the willing sacrifice. And that's the easiest and the hardest thing that we have to do, is that willing to sacrifice ourselves, our inflations, our ego, our desires to something greater. And so when Cain was the Puer Aeternus. He wouldn't accept responsibility. He wouldn't even allow his brother to show him there was another way. He had to kill his brother. Well, I think we do that all the time. We try to kill off our shadow. We try to drown it. We try to distract it, rather than see it as a corrective, and then do what's necessary and kind of lean into that. So I guess that's all I have to say at this point.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Muriel. David, would you like to say anything before we go to the next person?
I would just say that everyone should do a deep dive about Muriel. She is amazing. Take a look at her website, what she's about. I just have so much respect and admiration for her, and I'm flattered you made the time to come to this talk. So it's great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Muriel, and would love to have you back. I'll reach out to you. Thank you. George, would you like to make any comment? And then Aidan, and then anybody else. So we'll open it up for everybody else. George, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Hey, David. Hi. I got here late, so I don't think but I just want to repeat what a few people have said. Bravo, bravo. I love what I heard. I love your enthusiasm, and that's all I have to say at this moment.
Sure.
But
Thank you.
I do want to say something. It just occurred to me, but it's kind of out from left field. One of the reasons I'm late is I was at a cafe reading Chris Hedges' book, if you guys are familiar with his stuff. And I left it at the entrance, but I think it's called The Death of the Liberal Class. And he trashes both, West and East. And as I'm listening to David, and as I heard what Muriel said regarding West and East, I think perhaps Chris Hedges should read this material. I think it may, because I agree a lot with him, and I think the problem of corporate capitalism is the puer, and I think maybe perhaps Chris Hedges might enrich his perspective. I mean, it's already enriched, but I think it might amplify it a bit more. So yes, I did want to say something.
Thank you, George. All right, Aidan, would you like to add anything at this point, or and otherwise we're going to open it up for everybody. Please go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment or raise your hand in Zoom. Aidan, go
I'll
ahead.
say something quick. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, David. Great to see you and hear the presentation. And it was fun. David and I got to catch up this week and look forward to the night. So it was cool to see that what you've been working on. And I guess the only thing I would add is in terms of the urgency of the problem, sort of like you were touching on, David and Muriel as well, which is indicated by the popularity of the book itself, you know, that it's sold so many copies. You could say that the psychology of the puer is very resonant. Jung's idea is that the psychology of the author sort of makes his or her work a subjective confession, and the attitude of the author is going to sort of seep its way into the work. So, like from Jung's point of view, like he would have some clients who resonated more with Freud, with a more reductive analysis than his own style. So he would give them Freud to read, and that's the language they would use because that's the reality that they were resonant with, was more of a Freudian attitude than a Jungian one. Same with Adler. And in this case, the puer, we have this idea that the eternal child is something that is very ripe at the sort of resonant cultural level. I think of Peter Pan, sometimes the puer syndrome is called like the Peter Pan syndrome. And if you sort of tie those two images together, it's sort of like the never growing up image that you get from Peter Pan, the never being able to stay on Earth, and this idea that this sort of home base is away from Earth, sort of at outer space, like the little prince comes down from the stars, right, or from his star, and ends back in the stars. So his existence is sort of this spiritual domain. It's not earthly. And similar with Peter Pan. And it's worth noting that that this idea of the puer, for those who want to dig into this book, it's really worth it, especially the part on the little prince. But yeah, she's pretty clear that the core problem is a mother complex. Like the core puer thing is that it's a mother attached man that hasn't been able to separate from the mother psychology and the mother relationship, and that's tied to not being able to get one's feet on the ground, one's own sort of independence, like in the Little Prince. Well, I should say it's akin to being devoured by the unconscious. So one's unconscious is at the helm instead of one's conscious, as you say, David, like the heroic quest of sort of conscious intention. And I'll wind down with this, but it's interesting in the Little Prince, he sort of starts from the stars, comes down, only sees positive in childhood, doesn't see the positives of adulthood. And when he dies, willingly by the snake, he goes back to the stars and reminds the author that he'll be looking down, laughing from the stars. But there's this sense that he's not able to, if we were to take this image into like an analysis or like into a therapeutic or a personal development sense, the hope, I think, would be to take such an energy and bring it into embodiment in a sustained embodiment. Like Jung's idea of the cure for the puer problem is work. Work for men and creative work for women. Maybe that's sexist, but that's how he puts it, and she puts it. So embodying the inspiration, the spirit, the trans egoic, the archetypal dimension, and embodying it in one's life in a consistent and routine way, so that it doesn't just stay in the ethereal realm of like ideas and possibilities and futuristic stuff and hopefulness, and that the actual embodied daily routine work is the antidote to the Puer Aeternus problem. And there's a lot there. So it's worth digging into the Von Franz material. I also can relate to the Puer problem, like you, David. And I think many can. I mean, that's why I think it sells as well as it does. So here's to the work that Muriel's doing, that we're all trying to do. It's sort of this the integration, the conjunctio, the work that is hopefully for the good, for the common good. So thanks, Shrikant.
Thank you, Aidan. Folks, now it's open for everybody. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom in order to make comments or ask questions. Next up is going to be Paul. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. And hi, David. Thank you for your great words tonight, as before. You made a really impassioned speech in a way about, it was a vote to keep this legacy that of Freud, of Jung, really alive because we need it so much. You were very passionate about that. And there's, this may also, I took a quick look since she put it there at Muriel's website, so she may also want to chime in on this question, but looking at what she does. But the Jungian analysis world is not in the mainstream of what people are receiving as therapy directly. You may think it is there indirectly, but that's my getting at. What I'm getting at is there's a piece that feels like it might need to happen still that hasn't happened yet. That happened, for instance, in the link between Zen Buddhism and dialectical behavioral therapy. So Marsha Linehan, had a nervous breakdown. For those who don't know, she was like a teenager. She found no help in the general psychological treatments. She went to a Zen monastery as still a very young woman, but she ended up studying that for years and then incorporating it into something that what Aiden said reminded me of, a simple set of skills. So even though the people who are really deep Zen Buddhists probably scoff at it, she succeeded in bringing ancient wisdom traditions into behavioral clinics all over the world. I mean, so that hasn't happened with Jung, because you at the same time as you made your impassioned speech, you said how hard it is. You said the Red Book is incomprehensible. You said you really can't figure this stuff out unless you, but see, that's the missing link to getting your passionate plea for this to be more known, that I'm waiting for or wondering about. That's my thought. Thank you.
Go ahead, Dave.
No, I always love your comments. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you're absolutely right. To the other points, like, we're not having this adult conversation in our culture at all. We're sort of on autopilot. Think of all the traditions and the rituals, becoming a man or a woman that were in cultures forever. That was about sort of breaking your puerhood, right? We don't have that at all in our culture, let alone, we don't even have a discussion about that right now, let alone what you're talking about, institutionalizing it. And so that's sort of the urgency Muriel and Aiden were talking about, where look at our entertainment figures, it's textbook awareness. And so what will it take? You almost shudder at it. Will it take a social psychological breakdown to start asking those questions? Are we sort of there right now? So I agree with you 100%. Like, what will it take to start having a conversation about what's really happening? So we're not there.
Muriel, go ahead. Muriel, and then Aiden, and then we'll go to the next one. Great question, Paul. Go ahead, Muriel.
Yeah, to respond to Paul, I think the problem, Hillman said it well, 100 years of psychotherapy and we're still a mess. And so the idea that psychology has been co-opted by the customer satisfaction business. And that's in part, I'm gonna hang my flag. It's the colleges and it's the regulating bodies that says we can't ask people to suffer. And that something like Jungian psychology is always going to be fringe. And thank God for that, because I don't want to be part of the mainstream when I look at what the mainstream is. And that is quick fixes and just shore people up so they can go back into the insanity and not call it insane. Well, if you are suffering in this culture, you're probably more sane than if you're getting along well, because we are in the end times. Our world is ending. It's happened before and it will happen again. And what do we do during the end times? We build a boat and save the seeds. I mean, that is just classic. We build a boat and save the seeds. Well, sometimes something like an analytical container is the best boat you can build in order to give people a place to suffer and suffer through to some kind of meaning, not erase the suffering, because in the wound is the gold. Like, it's not about transcending the suffering or getting out of the suffering. It's finding the capacity within yourself and within relationship to endure it to its teleological meaning, that there is a purpose in it. Jung said that we can endure anything if we can see its meaning. So we are in a meaning crisis in our culture. And psychology should be showing the way, not just trying to shore up the culture, the world that is ending. So, I mean, that's my 2 cents. The comments that Aidan made about the unholy alliance between the Puer Aeternus and the devouring mother. I mean, that's huge. And we have a generation of boys who don't know how to be men. And I call upon all the older men that you have shirked a responsibility. And as raised by feminists, I can understand why that is. But that's the problem of the Puer Aeternus, is the dragon has not been slain. And boys don't know that they have to take up the heroic quest, and it will be suffering. Without a doubt, it will be suffering. But that whole idea of, well, but we're not really going to make you suffer. It's just symbolic. No, as David pointed out so beautifully, these characters in Jung's psyche said, not just symbols were real. This suffering is real. We've got a lot of neurotic suffering going on in our culture in the absence of real suffering. And people don't know how to go to that depth, and that's what the rituals would do. But even if we don't have the rituals, we have the archive of the literature that can show us the way. It's there. Like, read the Grail legends, for God's sake. It's there.
Thank you, Muriel. Next up is going to be Aidan, followed by Zach. Aidan.
That's tough to follow. Next time I got to go before Muriel for my own ego's sake. No, but that was great. And in response to your question, Paul, I was thinking about it myself. And I had 2 thoughts. One is escaping me, so I guess I'll skip that one. And the other thought is, I love the Marsha Linehan example. People speculate what Jung was going through in his Red Book era, like with his break with Freud, where he was really essentially like seeing hypnagogic visions. He's like hallucinating auditorily, visually. He was talking to his spirit friends in the garden, and at the dinner table, holding the dinner table to not fall through the earth. He had to even repeat in his head his address and to remind himself who he is and his grounded identity. And people speculate, how to make sense of that period for him. I tend to land on the side of the creative illness arguments, that it was a creative illness that he went through that was that had this teleological aspect, like Muriel was pointing to. And so did Marsha Linehan. Like, there's a cohort of people who go through a period of life where they break down, The old way doesn't work anymore. Like Muriel was saying, this happens at the cultural level and it also happens at the individual level. The old way doesn't work anymore. There's some kind of breaking down. I think of Marsha Linehan, I think of Jung, I think of Byron Katie, I think of Robert Pirsig, who I'm a big fan of, and these people who have severe, now we call it midlife crisis, although Marsha Linehan was much younger, but the idea being that their psyche cannot go forwards in the gradient and trajectory that it's going. Something stops, some kind of breakdown, and in that incubation, something emerges, something that points to a new future. With Marsha Linehan, her whole thing was, I have to figure this out. That was when we're talking about the urgency, her thing was, I have to figure this out so that I can help others. There was like a piercing confidence and motivation to break through so that she could help others. And I think that's kind of a cool reference point. I mean, I think that urgency is in some of Jung's writings and moments where he kind of feels this need to break through and to be able to make these things, hence, making the Red Book or many of the things he writes. So it's a really good parallel, I think, Paul. And that sense of, my point is, being the person who's going through it and has that experience is different than being the people who sit in their armchairs and talk about it. That's not the same thing. And there's a quote, Jung's Queer Man in the Cave, of this. He gives this metaphor, which I love. Maybe I'll leave it on this note, where it's this man who is living in a cave, meditating, spending his time in deep, deep, deep reflection, taking the internal experiences he has and charting them on the wall. It's like first one graph and then a more evolved graph, and days and months and years. The images evolve and his inner life is manifest in different ways and his understanding manifests in different ways. And then at some point down the line, other people come in and see these drawings born out of his suffering and born out of his encounter with self. And they take the images and say, oh, that's what it is to be enlightened. Oh, that's the symbol of magic, and take it out of the cave as if they've taken something. But what they've taken is the result. They haven't taken the work. They haven't taken the process. They haven't taken the experience. They've taken the result. So Jung is for people who want to go through the process. They want to go through the experience. They want to go through the suffering, as Muriel says, not the neurotic suffering, the legitimate suffering of a self-encounter. And people who are interested in going through that process will be interested in Jung. But yeah, that is not for everybody. And it is way more pretty and elegant and cute to have the result on your paper than it is to go through that, I think. So that's my response.
Thank
And
you.
Shrikant, I'd like to build on Paul's question.
Please.
So it sounds like I'm making an impassioned plea for us to recognize Jung and what his influence could be, which is true. But I want to point out that if you go out on the street of any major city, you're going to see a billboard, some heroic character. And a lot of those writers were saying we had tremendous influence from Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. And Joseph Campbell is really building it off a Carl Jung foundation. So on one level, you're seeing the influence of Jung where these hero stories attract the masses. But then on the flip side of that, you're seeing Jung's influence going, but you don't understand. It's to Aiden's point, Aiden and Muriel's, your hero story is superficial. It's easy. You have not gone through the real hero's journey and suffered to meet your true spirit and soul. No way, no how. So it's hero's journey light, right? But it's powerful enough to take that hero's journey where it's dominated popular culture, but it's almost like the superficial understanding of what the real hero's journey is. But it's powerful enough that it lights up our entertainment. On the flip side is, if you don't fully understand that hero's journey that has at its core Jung, you'll just fly off into self-deception and start medicating yourself. The fentanyl, the opioid crisis. So all these people are going into addiction centers. And there you find Jung again saying, yeah, you're addicted because you're unwilling to go through the suffering and the hero's journey to find out who you are. So unconsciously, Jung has a giant influence on our popular culture on both ends of that. And I find that fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Muriel, you had a follow-up. Go ahead.
Yes, I just want to follow up, and that is, I think that there's something incredibly generative in that, in the quest for the hero, like the impulse to save the world, the impulse to do something really noteworthy, but an uninitiated heroic versus an initiated heroic. So one of the things that I've learned about initiation, and this is coming from First Nation elders, is that it is the responsibility of the community to recognize and bear witness to the emerging gifts in the youth, in the young men and in the young women. And the process of initiation is to tell them where that gift is needed in their community. And so when they come out of that initiation ceremony, they come out to serve, not themselves, not their gifts, but to use their gifts to serve the culture, to use the gifts to serve the tribe or their people. And I think that that's a piece that's missing, that we are so, and maybe in some part Jung's definition of individuation has been co-opted and deformed to say, well, it's all about me. And so the narcissism that's involved in that, it makes it incredibly destructive. So yes, you have to do the work of finding your way to what your daemon is asking of you, and then you have to bring it back. Because even people who so-called individuate, or they find the truth and then they want to somehow isolate on a mountaintop, then what's the point? The point is that we have to keep furthering consciousness into culture. And I mean, that's, so it's both, you know, Jung's definition of the self, the center and the circumference. Well, that just doesn't make any logical sense. How can something be both the center and the circumference? But I think that's the brilliance of it. It's the idea that whatever is in you is going to manifest in your reality. The visions that you see, Salome was blind in Jung's vision. So it says something about his access, even in those visions, to his feeling function was so blinded by his intellect. Of course it was. So what he had to sacrifice was his intellect to come into his feeling function. And he said how hard that was. The point in the Red Book when he has to kill Siegfried, oh my God, he was devastated by that. But the Red Book gave him that container. And even John Perry Weir, who did that profound work with schizophrenia, where he said that even in those ranting delusions is a secret healing that's trying to come through. So if it can be contained, if it can be held, if it can be allowed to live itself out. Jung says the complex is never resolved until it's lived out to its full. Well, that's scary, because I know my complexes, and if I have to believe they have to be lived out, while living them out through art and living them out through contained relationships and living them out through your imaginings, that's the purpose. So it can find the jewel that's in the dross.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Muriel. I want to follow up on this one, but I'm going to, first we're going to go with Zach, and then I'm going to come back to this theme. So Zach, go ahead.
Great. Thank you, David and Muriel and Aiden. This has been really awesome. So I read the book last month and was just hoping David or whoever can kind of connect some dots for me. I was going to read just a paragraph that I think kind of captures this idea. She says, the important thing is that he should stick something out. If it is analysis, then analyze seriously, take the dreams seriously, live according to them. Or if not, then take a job and really live the outer life. The important thing is to do something thoroughly, whatever it is. But the great danger of the neurotic problem is the Puer Aeternus, or the man caught in this problem, tends to do what Saint-Exupery does here, just put it in a box and shut the lid on it in a gesture of sudden impatience. And from my understanding, she and Jung both think the kind of cure for this problem is not only work, but like sticking to just one thing, or kind of committing oneself, because the puer tends to kind of abandon something the moment the kind of going gets tough, or the moment that he or she gets impatient. And my question is, I mean, you know, it's also a personal question, because I definitely tend to have this, I noticed this within myself, a kind of tendency to kind of jump from thing to thing. But I've always kind of, at least personally, identified it more as just like, I'm in like the 97% percentile of like the big five openness, and just like very interested in a lot of things. But I think this is an interesting take where she's saying it's more impatience, and, you know, the puer, she even calls him lazy at times, or like undisciplined. So my question is, could it be both of those things kind of at play within an individual? And the kind of follow-up to that question is, how is the kind of impatience, or the weak ego complex, or the lack of industriousness, how is that kind of caused by the overbearing mother? I guess I don't quite understand how this psychology is kind of formed through the mother complex. So I hope that made sense.
It makes sense. I'll take an initial stab. I'd love to hear from others as well. I love that you're bringing it up. When I was preparing this talk, I was really looking at that section as well, where he says, you know, the cure is work, basically. And I had to sit with that. What did he mean exactly by work? And in my own journey, you can work hard at something, but then you can really run up against some defense mechanisms, right? And it's amazing, as Jung said, I said in my presentation, people have a lot of fear of the unknown. So you sort of, when you define work in the beginning, you might have, you're defining the work, right? So I'm going to do, but then when you get anywhere close to the unknown, most people are like, I don't get it, or I give up. So it's when you get to that place where you really feel that defense mechanism, are you going to work through that? That's sort of how I interpret that on one level, you know, because like, yeah, you could do work, you go to these things, you could read a lot, etc. But I think what they're talking about is the work of, are you going to go down into that depth? And really the work is allowing yourself to be afraid. And most people they just bail. They just bail from that. The mother complex, well, I've defined Puer Aeternus in a little bit different way, in terms of you're an eternal child unless you go through, as Muriel mentioned, an initiation of understanding your real world. You know, and it's legitimate when we say, well, the puer child has a mother complex. That's a very interesting, complicated thing to really study. Part of the mother complex is you're not very good with your feeling function. You know, sort of the mother represents feeling, the father sort of represents thinking. It's a generalization. And a lot of men are conditioned like, you know, Men don't cry. You know, we're terrible when it comes to feelings, basically. We overthink and analyze. So I'm not doing the subject justice, but it has to do with our unease, our complex, formed by our mothers, of everything that involves feelings and emotions. And so the puer likes to be protected by mommy, you know, and doesn't develop their own feelings and emotions. So the work, just to tie it together, is you have to work to separate yourself from like being in that womb of your mom. Basically, you have to sort of separate that out in your own psyche, and that requires work. Again, very general, but I think you're hitting on the most important part of this, which is, are we willing to do the work? And Jung's almost shrugging, going, most people are not going to go on this journey. Let's just be honest. It's too hard. You're too fearful. You're just going to go on drugs or try and escape. So what you're talking about, Zach, is the key to the whole thing. Are you willing, however you define it, to really work at this? And I hope people do, because what I tried to show in my talk is what you'll discover in the real hero's journey is incredible.
Thank you. Thank you, David. All right. So folks, go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you have further questions. I want to bring up a question, partly in response to what Paul said about the condition of, you know, our modern world, which is full of pures. I think that is true. And I also want to connect it up with something that Muriel said as being the solution to this. You know, she used the term willing sacrifice. David used the term conscious hero. So I want to talk about this. You know, what is the modern situation? Now, I'm going to use, I've been studying the scriptures. So I'm going to use examples from that. Okay. And tell me whether this makes sense. You know, I'm not that familiar with this work, but I see this as being just taking the fruit and saying that I'm not going to do the work to tend the tree, to even look at the true vine from which it comes, the source from which, and modern world is full of so much fruit that you could be going from one to other. And you think that you're doing something because your life is full of things, but you're never really getting into what it takes to tend the garden, what it really takes for you to produce something at a very fundamental level. And what is it that is the solution to this kind of seeking of fruit? And I would just simply say, you know, it is the willing sacrifice. I mean, to put it very bluntly, it's the cross. You know, you have to basically say, look, I'm carrying an old man with me. Am I willing to face the truth? And am I willing to take the pain of letting go of the old man in order to be born anew? And that's something that is being faced at every moment. You have a choice to do that. That is your conscious choice to live, to be conscious of truth now. But it is tremendously painful, because the more you're committed to doing that, more you're committed to looking at all of your old man, no matter what it is. And it is hard, but that is the solution, I think, because it both captures the conscious hero and the willing sacrifice. So any thoughts, David and Muriel?
Why don't you go ahead, Muriel?
Yeah, I think that that's very succinct. And to put it in the context of the story of the cross is one that is very much foundational in our culture. You don't have to be religious to know that that permeates, that is the greatest story ever told, and because it holds all the archetypal truths. And so that, yeah, it's the idea that if you feel that your suffering is somehow fated and, you know, you are a victim of circumstances. And it's like when Percival goes into the Grail Castle the first time and he's so naive, he's such a puer, he doesn't even ask the questions and it all disappears. But when he goes the second time, he knows that there are two questions he has to ask. And the first one is, what ails you? Like, what is the wound? So we can look at our culture and we can say, what are the wounds? But that's where we're stuck. We're stuck on this victimization. We're stuck on all the ways in which we've been wounded, all the ways that we failed. The second question is the most important because both Arthur and Percival know on some level that the wound of the Fisher King will not heal. He's the dying king. He's the world that's dying. He's the old way. And when Percival says, and what does the Grail serve? He's essentially saying, and what does your suffering mean? What is its purpose? And what Arthur says is the Grail serves the Grail King, meaning I don't want you to serve me. I'm not the highest authority. I'm serving something greater. I'm serving something transcendent. And I think that that's what we've lost sight of. And, you know, I'm going to go out on a limb here. The rational atheists who are saying we can do it ourselves. It's a human project. It's a mind project. We can take it in. Even that is waning because what's its purpose? What does it serve? And so I do think that, you know, I'm just going to riff a little bit on what David said about the mother complex. Medusa as an example of the devouring, the gaze will turn you to stone. Well, when the hero is able to cut off her head because he doesn't look directly at her, he uses the gifts he's been given. We're often told that what rises out of her neck is Pegasus, the winged imagination, poetic imagination. And how often do we forget that also Chrysor came out of the neck stump? So there's the winged imagination, all that possibility, all that potential, all that eternal ideas. And then there's the sword of discrimination. There's that ability to limit it. What a puer hates more than anything is limits. And when he is limited, the suffering begins. And that's where he has to take up his cross. So whether that limitation is boredom or that limitation is just getting sick to death of hearing yourself tell the same old story, that is where the limit stops that eternal potential and the rubber hits the road. So I love the idea of the cross. I mean, it's the vertical and it's the horizontal. It's like connecting you to something higher than you can ever know, and also reaching out and opening up your heart to the willingness to suffer.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Muriel. David, what do you think?
So building on Zach's question and what Muriel was saying, so the mother and father complex are related to your actual human mother and father, right? When you're growing up, they're your parents. And so your idea of masculinity or spirituality is your father complex. You don't, they're gods to you and a goddess, basically. So you form this unconscious conditioning of what the masculine spirit and the feminine soul are from your parents. The initiation is doing the work, what you're talking about, Zach, of separating from the human father and mother, their complexes, and going inward and uniting with your divine parents, which is your real spirit and soul. And so if you're conditioned going, well, mama is too emotional and feeling I'm uncomfortable, then when you reflect back into your own inner feminine and soul, you don't have a good relationship to that. So that's what they're talking about, the mother complex, because, and it's natural, of course, you're going to form it on your mother and father. The pain is separating from the human and going into those divine. And the cross, which is an amazing symbol to me, is it's really your ego that's being destroyed on the cross. So you have a divine experience, and it's a crucifixion. It's really painful. And I like what Jung was saying is, if you know the end goal, which I was trying to show in my presentation, that you can unite with these divine characters, if you know that end goal, that hero's journey is worth it. It's brutal, but if you don't know the end goal, chances are you're not going to do it, or the suffering becomes too much. You're just going to medicate yourself. But what Jung was saying is, whether you like it or not, and he put this over his doorway, and I'll just paraphrase it, whether you like it or not, the divinity is inside you. It wants to be known, basically. It will shake you apart. And so it's not like you can just cruise through life and say, well, I'll just ignore all this mystical mumbo jumbo. It wants to be known. And that's the work. That's the work you need to do.
Thank you. David, I'll just make one more comment about the cross, and then we'll go to Aidan and Zach. In the Johannine tradition, in the early Christianity, actually, the way in which they looked at cross was truly profound, because they actually thought of it not like many of the Western Christians think of cross as pain. You know, they focus on the death part of it. But the Johannine Christianity, they focused on incarnation, so something coming down from the top to earth. So incarnation, then death, then going down in the ground. Remember, the cross goes down in the ground. So going into hell and bringing whatever is alive back. And then kind of, so that's the resurrection. And then ascension, going back up, and then Pentecost, which is the horizontal, that is spreading it out. So that as a continuous movement, that is a Jacob's ladder, where the angels are going up and down continuously on you through your will, through your conscious choice. And you always have a choice whether you're going to participate in this vertical movement or not. And you don't have a choice. You have to go down into ground in order to pull things out from there. Thank you. Next up is going to be Aidan, followed by Zach. Aidan.
Yeah, I was thinking about Zach's question, but then sitting with what everybody was adding as well in the topic and the cross topic. I doodled something while I was listening. I don't know how well this will read, but you could see like archetype and instinct as the vertical axis, and then on the left, like the left of the ego, shadow, syzygy, self. And to the right, these are arbitrary terms, but you get sort of a sense of like an outward movement between family and community and culture. And I thought of that because the verticality versus the horizontality is so important to me. And actually Muriel brought this to my attention as we were talking, like the introverted thing is going to be that vertical axis, like you're talking about, Shrikant, this sort of descent and ascent and this ladder, and it's a vertical axis, right? So as an individual, as a vertical axis, I can traverse this incredible verticality, whatever, heights and lows. And you're right, like the Johannine perspective, and also, this Christian perspective of like, that as Jesus is on the cross, he does, go into hell after he dies for 3 days and then comes back up in a sense. But fundamentally, it's this very vertical axis. Whereas the extroverted thing, which is so important, is the cultural narrative and the sort of belonging at a horizontal level. where we can take our learnings and communicate them and share in the ritual, in the initiations, in the cultural developments, not just as sort of isolated individuals, but as sort of sprouts from the same rhizome from sort of a Jungian point of view. And that is so important to have both. I think Jung's perspective, I think it's in the 6 collected works, but I was having trouble finding this. But he does say somewhere that we have to start either inner, grow roots on the inner level, it's introverted, like vertical inner level, and then turn outwards. That would be a form of individuation that's sort of from an introverted perspective. Or we take root on the outer level, and then we have to find it on the inner, right? So starting, whether we begin our individuation journey on a more extroverted social environment and then go inwards. I'm watching my uncle go through this right now, and it's awesome because I'm very introverted. And so seeing him become more introverted is a real joy because we're connecting on new levels, as he's in his second half of life. Or we start on the introverted. That was my cave example, the man in the cave, but I could see where that's really one-sided. It's like if someone's going through the cave experience, that's a very introverted, vertical way of becoming, and then whether it's Buddha or whether it's Jesus or any sort of religious hero, you would hope that person would vocalize whatever they're learning at a horizontal level into culture, into society in such a way that it benefits. In fact, I think Jung says that's the cost of being an individual, right? The cost is you have to bring something back of equal or better value than you would have added by just going the root course of your culture, right? If you just want to fit in, then that's adding a certain value. If you're going to deviate and become an individual, the cost is you have to bring something back of equal or better value than what you would have been in this sort of traditional course. Otherwise, it's just autoerotic. It's just a sort of solipsistic event. You haven't added anything, and your life is sort of, if anything, it's kind of detracted from the collective. So that's tricky, right? In terms of the question of the mother complex thing, I did want to touch on that quickly. This is a place where I deviate a little bit from the Jungian thought because
can I interrupt you for a second? Let me comment on that part,
Sure.
and we'll go back to
because so many things on the table.
Yeah, exactly. No, this is great. This is great. So I just want to share with you because I find that first time we did this entire set of meetups with Jung, I was not at all familiar with religion, and over the last 2 years we've studied Tao Te Ching, Bhagavad Gita, and the Bible in great amount of detail. We have done about 100 meetups each on those. And what I'm finding is that I'm seeing how deeply, as David pointed out, there is this spiritual, there is a spiritual outlook, which actually is infused in Jung, and which is the reason why Jung is not popular, because spirituality is not a very big thing in the modern world. We are far more material culture. What I want to say here, what I want to point out is that these older cultures like Tao Te Ching, Bhagavad Gita, or Gospel of John have solutions to problems of modern times, which are really profound and really, really beautiful. So for example, this thing about, individual, introvert, and extrovert, what do you do for yourself and what do you do for others, right? The way in which the Bible deals with this is, it's the famous Shema, which is saying, love your God with all your heart. So that is kind of the upward movement. And love your neighbor as yourself, okay? Now you may think that these are two things, okay? But when you actually look at the New Testament, they're not. Like in 1 John, he says, if you say you love God and hate your brother, you lie. Because this is creation, it's like you're seeing the other person as image of God. You're seeing the God in the other person, divine in the other person. How can you think of it? How can you hate that while you claim to love God? There is a oneness to it. So the individual growth towards God, which is actually the core of you, brings you closer to the core of others. It allows you to see past the surface differences in order to connect to the core of you. In the Bhagavad Gita tradition, it is this namaste. Namaste means the God in me greets God in you. So it is at once in a single movement. It is affirming the God in yourself, which is purely individual, and it is affirming the God in others, which is purely social, in one single movement. That's a very profoundly integrated way of thinking about this, and it really solves this problem at a very deep level. Thanks, Eden. Please go on.
I love that. Thanks, Shrikant. And I really appreciate the sort of tying these different perspectives together, like the Jung piece and the John Gospel and the Bhagavad Gita and the Tao Te Ching. I mean, it's really thought-provoking to see. And I think it's really in the spirit of Jung to take these this comparative approach and see where they do hold together. I just really appreciate that. Yeah, in response to Zach's question about the mother complex, I'd be curious Muriel's take on this for sure. My understanding, there's some places now where I deviate some from like a classical Jungian perspective, because it's I do see Jung as more of the vertical and so much on the sort of like archetypal train, which is so rich. David and I were talking about this week. But there's other like thinkers that I really appreciate in terms of the horizontal piece, the relational piece. You know, I think it was Margaret Mahler or whatever, it talks about this idea of hatching. You talk about this is all over object relations too, but the idea that in child development, initially there's this symbiotic relationship between a son and the mother, and the two are really intertwined or enmeshed, functionally so. I mean, it's meant to be, but the fantasy life of the infant and the reality, the relation of the mother and the breasts and the, you know, what's happening in outer life are not so well differentiated. They're kind of fused. So this sort of idea of the hero's quest is partly, as I understand it, this sort of hatching process and this ego development process of standing on one's own 2 feet, in and apart from a symbiotic relationship with the mother, including one's own unconscious, which is sort of like a archetypal stand-in for the mother, so that you have like an egoic foothold it functions as an adaptation to your inner world and an adaptation to the outer worlds, like the social and professional. So the mother complex would be when that is not able to happen, when the son and the love and the mother, I was going to say lover because I was thinking of the son lover sort of dynamic, but when there's too much emotional intimacy, or there's too much attachment, or the son is too much an extension of the mother, then there's this situation where they're mother bound, like Von Franz talks about. And the cross, or, you know, think about, that's why I think in the Puer Aeternus situation, so much is about the future possibilities. Someday I'll get recognized. Someday I'll find the right thing. Someday I'll have the right job. Sometimes I'll meet the right partner. And it functions in this childlike state because everything's about the possibilities of the future. It's an extension of the like not growing up idea, right? So like, since we're talking about Christianity, Shrikant would use this like in the Christian mythos, not in terms of like Bible thumping, but just following that thread. It's like we have Christ, the man God, and the crucifixion, and the sense of like this spirit meeting matter in the God man, which is an archetype, the God man archetype of Christ. But we also have this sort of nativity scene that we celebrate, right? Like the divine child aspect of Christ, where, we celebrate his birth and the nativity scene and this aspect of it, where, because that is the birth of the future, right? Like the birth of Christ is the birth of the future Christ and what becomes the Christian mythos, right? But if Christ stayed an infant forever, like if you imagine Christianity where like the image of Christ stayed as a child, like a Dionysian kind of image, or like a Puer Aeternus image, or like a Cupid type image that never touches the ground and never becomes a man and never has this sort of outward motion, we would miss such a huge part of that myth, of that religion. So if we take it into account in our own lives, it's this sort of sense of, yes, we want to be birthed and exist in a nascent state of future possibilities and future options and things that could happen where things click for us in the future. But we also want to develop over time, like the Christian mythos, he studied a lot of the Old Testament, and then he went into his own retreat, whatever you believe about that. And he came back with a lot of work, spiritual work. So it wasn't like he just stayed in this sort of childlike state. And I think that's kind of what's asked of us too, is to not be in the world of possibility, but to deal with the passing of time, the Saturnine passing of time, chronological time, and not just to be only a possibility of becoming, but in the act of becoming and in the act of manifesting. So the exploring of possibilities, Zach, is very exciting. And it's sort of like, I can jump here and I can jump there, and I do that too. But this idea of commitment is this idea of like, I'm going to commit to something and develop the routine and move forwards. So it's not a constant like sidestep here, sidestep here, sidestep here, and allow the future to stay in front of me forever. That would be like a mythology where Christ is just always a nativity scene. You know what I mean? So that's my thoughts about that.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up is Muriel. Then I'll make a comment and then we'll go to Zach. Muriel, go ahead.
I love that, Aiden. I love that that framing it around the Christian mythos. So let me just riff on that, because I think it reflects what David has definitely presented and what Zach has asked, that has got this rich kind of back and forth and deepening going on. That, Christ's first miracle was the wedding at Cana. And if you study that text, he wasn't ready. And his mother is the one that came to him and said, now. And so I think that's so brilliant, because yes, he may well have stayed in, I am the son of the Father, I am the son of God, all these possibilities, but it had to manifest. They're thirsty for spirit, we're out of wine. And so he takes something so mundane and so profound like water, and he turns it into wine. And then he goes to the desert. So it's like the suffering to say, but I'm only 30 years old, surely not yet. I mean, come on. Even Jung says it doesn't happen till midlife. It shouldn't have, give me more time. I'd like to get a PhD. I'd like to just travel Europe. I'd like to just do some, and she's the one who says now. And that's the conjunctio, that the positive mother complex, recognizing the gifts, and also saying, if you stay in the womb, it becomes a tomb. And he has to accept that challenge. And then he meets his demons, right? He goes into the desert and he meets his demons. Well, that's the individuation process. And that's how to redeem the puer. And I would also say this, David, like that idea of the divine parents. On that Saturday, the apocryphal stories say that he went into hell, and what he did is he redeemed the world parents. He pulled out of the unconscious Adam and Eve and said, it's not just about your personal parents, it's about they are redeemed, they are part of the divinity. So if you're almost 65 and still struggling with the personal mother and the personal father, you will struggle with it until your death. But hopefully what you're doing is you're pulling that up into consciousness.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Muriel. Thank you. Next up is going to be Zach.
Wow, this has been great. Well, so I was going to ask to kind of unpack another paragraph, but I kind of wanted to ask a quick follow-up from Mariel about what she was talking about. Is the idea with the Christ story a little bit like he needed to be of use to others, so he couldn't kind of just continue this perpetual learning, exploring possibilities. Like there was a real immediate need for the knowledge and experience that he already had. Is that kind of the idea, or am I missing that?
No, you got it well said. That's exactly it, right? And if I hesitate to psychologize Mary and Jesus, but I'm going to take a risk, and I'm going to say, like she wasn't asking him to carry her animus. Right. And that's the problem, is that if the culture is holding women down, then they are going to project that unlived life into their sons. And they're going to say, hey, here's possibility, rather than here's the man I married and we're both declining in possibility. Right. So it has to be that idea that she knows the world needs what he's got, and she will push him toward it, even if he is reluctant. And so the mother complex within us, has to be that part that says, I'm going to be disappointed and I'm going to be wounded, and this is not going to be easy, but I'm going to do it, because to stay in the womb would turn it into a tomb.
Thank you, Muriel. I want to say one more thing, and then we'll go back to Zach. So this is really, really fascinating, because the thing is that all of these people are heroes, Mary and Christ in various ways. Okay, so consider, for example, actually, birth of Christ is just like the cross. It's a fallen world. Everything has gone down. There is this poor girl, not a rich person, Mary, and she says, yes, come on down. Okay, that's what she says. And that's what gets everything started. And then there is this birth in this manger, which is fit for only animals. And in the middle of that fallen place, there is new birth taking place. It's the same thing. Like it's analogous to cross. Again, Mary also faces the same thing, because it's not just one person, it's everybody. Mary, it's like at the age of 12, he goes off and he vanishes. And she's trying to find him, and finally finds him, in the temple. And she says, why did you do this to us? And she said, well, what would you expect? You should expect me to be in. Or when he starts to, preaching to all these weird people who want to kill him, she goes along with her other children to say, okay, and his response is, who is my mother and who is my brother? So it is kind of separation. At the same time, the other person takes those words, like the way it is described is, Mary took those words and kept them in her heart. And that happens again and again. Again, look at the cross. People focus on Jesus. What about Mary? Imagine that, being there and saying, yes, if that's what needs to be done, that's what needs to be done. So there is that going through. Thank you. Zach, go ahead. Please read that other paragraph. Would love to. You're getting us started on many things. Go ahead.
All right, great. This is another juicy one. So this is, she's kind of commenting about the part in The Little Prince where the Little Prince is talking about cutting down the bilobob trees. Okay, so I'll just read the paragraph. Quote, one of the objections which the Puer I'll start over. One of the objections which the Puer Aeternus always brings up when you want to encourage him to fell the tree is that he does not want such a narrowing of the horizon. What would be left if he had to give up his wishful fantasies, his masturbating, and such stuff? He would just be a petty little bourgeoisie who goes to his office and so on. He could not stand such narrowing. But it is not true. If one has the courage to cut down this wrong kind of inner greatness, it comes again, but in a better form. The horizon and life are widened and not narrowed. I think this myth should always be told when the hero has to cut the tree, because that is always what he does not want to realize or believe. If he only knew how much wider life would be if he could give up that wrong kind of inner life, then he might perhaps do it. And I was going to kind of give you guys my interpretation of that and see if how you're, but I actually kind of don't want to do that. I'd rather just get it fresh without any of my bullshit.
No, I actually want to hear it, Zach.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Well, so initially I was kind of connecting it to this other quote that I heard recently that I had written down, and I think it might have actually been a Tony Robbins quote, but he says, in order to have unbelievable options and choices in your life, in your pursuit of your dream, you must eliminate them. You must shrink your focus down to one thing, one business, one focus at one time, and master it, get great at it for an extended period of time. And then it says, the irony of life is the more you shrink your options in pursuit of your dream, the more it will open them up later in your life. So that was my initial kind of thought about the tree actually being these other possibilities. And it's kind of this like elimination of excess possibilities to kind of focus down on one. But then I was kind of thinking, when Muriel was talking about the story of Medusa, that the tree kind of is symbolic of the mother. And there's a kind of, symbolic killing of the mother in that regard. So I guess, I don't know, there's a few different stand-ins for the symbol of the tree. I guess I could see tree kind of representing the unconscious, representing the mother figure. I could also see it representing possibilities. And she says in the quote, I think something about, what does she say? If he has the courage to cut down this wrong kind of inner greatness. So the tree represents this wrong kind of inner greatness. Maybe the tree represents this kind of like idealistic fantasy life. But I said a lot, so I'll stop talking now. But I'm curious how you all interpret that.
Who would like to go first?
I'll just give you
Go
my
ahead.
I'll give you my quick take. The tree could be like an invasive species, which is an invasive ego species, because trees represent something like the world tree. They usually represent something very rooted. If you look behind Aiden, he has a giant great tree behind him. So it's a very positive symbol. So it's almost like you can really develop an invasive species of ego-ness that really hardens, like that's really who you are. And it's terrifying to cut that tree down to allow maybe what's underneath it, could be the world tree, basically. I'm going to say something outrageous because we're coming to the end, but like when you were talking about the Tony Robbins quote, and even this tree, like looking back at this after reading Puer Aeternus 30 years ago, it's secondary. Like it's a lot of sound and fury around the ego, where the real hero's journey is going inside yourself and discovering that anima and animus. And so we can spend a lot of time saying, don't narrow your focus or your ego. There's whole industries that have been created about that. People pay $1 jillion about it. And it's sort of like we have to go to next level. Like there's something about when you were talking about Tony Robbins, who's great. I'm glad he helps a lot of people. When Muriel was talking about, it's like psychology light. It's like fizzy soda. That is clearly not the suffering and the journey we need. And so we can talk about cutting down trees. There's enough information now. It's like it's just one giant form of procrastination of the real work that needs to happen.
Thank you, David. Aiden.
As we're hitting time, by the way, I was gonna say, like, if anybody wants to continue, or I know Zach, I'm interested in hearing more about your passages and takeaways from the book. So I can offer my Zoom room if people are going to stay on.
No,
Is that
that's fine.
cool?
No. We can continue. There is no problem continuing.
Okay, cool. So because I could stay on a couple more hours, so that's perfect. We'll just stay here for a couple more hours. Yeah, thanks, Shrikant. That's great. Appreciate it.
No, I'm okay with that.
Okay.
I'm okay with taking more time.
Thanks, man.
Yet everybody else speaking as well. So
Yeah,
and
sorry, I'm
David,
hogging.
whenever you need to leave, you're welcome to leave. But I don't want to cut the conversation off. Go ahead.
Zach, this reminds me of the Nebuchadnezzar passage from your podcast when I was guessing, which is I don't know, that felt like a pretty good plug if you ask me. So anyways, that was pretty good. Zach does a podcast called Unpacking Ideas that's very thought-provoking and has interesting guests talk about key topics across history.
Zach, can you put a link in the chat, please?
And I was an honored, distinguished guest on the talking about Jung and dreams, and we talked about the Nebuchadnezzar dream that Daniel translated in the Bible, and so it kind of reminds me of that image, this tree image, because the tree, it's so complex. I mean, it's a self image, so we could be a little lofty and try to contain it, but it has a lot of associations, and I couldn't say the tree means this. But it has the sort of roots that go into the underground. It has the branches that reach into heaven. It's got the snake at the bottom. It's got the eagles in the branches. It can be a tomb. It can be a cross. It can be the source of everlasting life. It's very, 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 very layered. And that's just like the surface. But I think, Zach, why I thought of the Nebuchadnezzar tree image is because the way she's talking about it is the negative fantasy life, like the death mother aspect of the tree, which is closer to like Attis or Osiris or anywhere that's like the death mother, where it's the inner possibility of growth, but it's a negative individuation, like the wealth of fantasy.
Let's do one thing. Judy wants to say something before she leaves.
Oh,
Judy,
do it.
Judy, you need to unmute.
I will be really quick. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I live with a real life Puer. He is 78 years old today, and he's an artist, but he's also a businessman. He has been a very happy Puer. He hasn't suffered at all. And he has been very, I just wanted to give this case study. It's pretty important. But he's older now, and so he's now trying to make that transition from Puer to Senex, to the old wise man. And this tonight has helped me to help him because he doesn't know that much Jung, and he doesn't take these courses like I do. And I'm not an analyst or anything like that. I just absorb things and say what I feel that is the best thing to say to others. But so thank you. I just wanted to thank you because you have given me great insights to help in this transition when you're no longer a Puer. Because at one point in time, you're not going to be a Puer anymore. It's not fun to be a Puer. So you did it all. You played. You had fun. It was great. You know, it's time to go home and put the coffee, the tea kettle on and lie down and do your thing. Read your books and all kinds of other things. So thank you. I just wanted to let you know that tonight has helped me a lot. I do have to go, and I hope that you will have this transcribed, or maybe we can see a video later on about the rest of the
I'm going to put up
evening.
I'm going to put up the video very soon. In the next couple of days,
yeah,
up on the YouTube channel.
Thank you very much. You guys are just wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Please continue, Aiden.
Yeah, I'll be quick at the end because I do want to leave space if anybody else wants to jump in too. But I think that with this image of the tree, it's sort of this idea of the fantasy side of the tree. You're talking about like the being in the spiritual, like being above earth, the overgrowth of the above ground fantasy, right? So again, we're leaving Earth, like the Puer on the airplane, or like Peter Pan into Neverland. We're getting away from Earth and up into the air. And that's where this lush overgrowth is. So it's sort of the negative individuation where the fantasy is overgrown, but the action is undone. That the unlived life is correlated with the growth. And the cutting down, I love the way she uses this example. This is what I'll finish it with. In the Finnish epic, Kalevala, however you say that, between the divine child and the tree, the idea is that in the cutting of the tree, there's a negative resistance from the puer psychology, but the idea is when the tree is cut, it's not a narrowing of the horizon, which is the fear of the limitation of the puer thing. It's pulling down that wrong growth of fantasy means a widening of the human horizon, because you can see more clearly around you, and your world on the human plane opens up, even though your world on the fantasy plane is sort of cut down. But it makes me think of the Nebuchadnezzar thing of like, he had to have the whole, if you don't do it, I think this is where midlife crisis comes in. If you don't participate in that process and you're too one-sided, nature or spirit will do it for you. And then you're really screwed. Then he had to live as an animal for 7 years to compensate for his spiritual lofty point. So wouldn't it be nice to participate in cutting the unlived stuff down enough to see, the human plane a little bit? Not that I'm good at that, but there's my take.
Thank you. Muriel next.
I'll just remind us that the definition of a symbol is the best representation of something unknown that points toward the mystery. And so the map is not the territory. So when I see this idea of the symbol of the tree, and you're right, it's so rich, it can be so layered, and it is so many things. Jung often says that when a tree shows up in a dream, it's the self, because it is rooted and it is reaching. But I do think there comes a point in our journey when whatever our most sacred cow is, that has to go to the altar. And it, like for me, I'll speak personally, it was realizing how I had put Jungian psychology at the top of the mountain. And when I realized that no, Jungian psychology has got me up the mountain, but it is an image that I need to look beyond. So whatever is that sacred cow, at some point it has to be put on the altar. When Nietzsche said, God is dead and we have killed him, so beware what you make a god. Well, I have people come to see me and they're dotems and they're tattooed on their bodies. And when the dream starts throwing up the negative side of that symbol, it's like they feel betrayed by their own unconscious. But it's to say, no, it is a portal now calling you to something greater. And you have to be prepared to let go of that, to find your way through, because it will become, it's like Abraham, talk about a puer. I mean, how long did it take him to get out of the tent, for God's sake, right? And then he's taking Isaac up the mountain. And so he had to be prepared to make that sacrifice. Literally, it's a nightmare. But symbolically, it says the thing you most value at some point has to go on the chopping block. And you have to be prepared to do that because you're being called to something greater.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Muriel. Would like to get more voices on the table. George, would you like to say anything? What do you think of the conversation so far?
The conversation has been incredible. I'm going to continue listening.
Okay, sounds good. Folks, go ahead, especially people who have not spoken before. If you would like to chime in, you're welcome to do that. And so firstly, let's see.
We should not let anybody go until Jorge says something.
No, that's not fair. David, Firstly, I want to ask you, how much time do you have? What's your preference?
My wife has my 7-year-old,
Okay.
so I'm just enjoying.
Okay. Okay.
Enjoying.
So, okay. But let's come back. Let's come back to the pure, Puer. So, what did you think of the conversation so far? You know, I really love the presentation because I think I really love the fact that you started with this image of the book, then took us through Jung and then came back. I love that structure. What did you think of all the conversations so far?
Well, I'm really pleased that you asked me to do this, because it helped me put a lot of the pieces of the puzzle together, especially realizing we are in a Puer matrix. Like, it's staggering. I don't mean this in a judgmental way. I was there long ago. We're going through generation of people who aren't sort of connected to what we're talking about in this conversation. And I don't want it to sound like a judgment, and I try to not do that in my talk. My personal fear and my personal journey was a sense of there's something going on. I'm supposed to realize something. And my fear was to just sail through a provisional life and not know. It's terrifying to me. I want to know what's going on. I want to know who I am. So when I was first talking about this, and I had a great conversation with Aiden and Miro before the talk, I really moved towards more of a personal journey story. And I feel very good that I don't really care so much about the outcome, like whether people believe me or not, or I was looking for validation. It was just like when you return from discovering something in the hero's journey, just putting it out there and saying, I thought it was awesome. This has helped me. I know I'm not out of left field, because a lot of people like who are here now and a lot of people out there agree with a lot I'm saying. So I feel very rooted about it. But then while I was hearing us talk, first of all, it was so great about these meetups, is you can feel very lonely with this perspective. I'm not saying it's greater or better or whatever, but there's a loneliness. I can only imagine what Jung felt back then, where he was really pioneering and going against the grain. So I'm just appreciative of being in this kind of group to resonate. But then I also feel, I don't know what the right emotion is. Like, it's almost overwhelming. Like, after we go for the night, my entire culture basically, like, I have a clear vision now of like sort of the Puer culture. I don't feel like, oh, I have to save the world. That would be very Puer. It's just more of a, maybe it's gratitude. It's gratitude to meet people like you. And you asked me to this talk. There's a gratitude of, like I said, Jung sort of had this smile on his face his whole life going, I know something. I'm trying to tell you it. But he also said, like, I just love knowing it. I'll just go off to Bollingen and carve some stuff and love it. So there's a lot of emotions flowing, but I think the main one is just gratitude. There's a gratitude I have for all this.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, your concept of Puer matrix is really, really fascinating, you know, because I think, so there are several things, you know, there is a distance, you know, and I feel it particularly after looking at all these kind of spiritual traditions, there is something that is missing in the modern culture. It's like the C.S. Lewis puts it, it's like we have lost the thou. I mean, not forget about how you characterize it, but some deep principle that runs through it, which gives you a source of responsibility within your own self and in everything around you, and you're trying to get to the truth all the time. It serves like the North Star for you. And if you don't have that, then you're just like a butterfly going around, hoping to find something. So I think the identification that we are living in a matrix is very deep. Judy has not asked before, so Judy, go ahead.
Okay, so I feel like I'm on a journey for many years. So a lot of what you were all talking about resonates with me, don't get me wrong. But I guess one thing I'm wondering is a lot of this sounds vague. So are there questions there are types of questions that people ask when they're doing this exploration, or could you make it more concrete for me or anyone else, so that I might know more about? I mean, I've had my own approach, but you seem like very wise people, so that's kind of my question.
Thank you, Judy. David, would you like to take that, or Muriel?
Well, I mean, welcome to the hero's journey, Judy. That's what I said, what taking the red pill was from the Matrix. It's up to you to do the work. And this presentation where I said, look, Jung and Von Franz weren't the only ones who helped me on the journey, but you got to pick up a Jung book or a Von Franz book. And it doesn't have to be them directly. There's so many books that, help you access them. Robert Johnson's very good as an example. But it's sort of like what we were talking about with Zach. You got to take the work seriously. And so it's when you say, what are the questions, or this is vague, that's exactly, I resonate with you. That's exactly where I was, where I showed you that dark forest in the beginning. I'm speaking about this more fluidly, but 30 years ago, I was in the place that you're talking about. And so it's going on that journey. It's, I think it's a great head start to read Jung and Von Franz. But it's not something we're going to answer in this session. We're giving you little breadcrumbs, basically, to start the journey. And I can tell you it's going to be worth it. It's going to be hard, but you can do it. You can do it starting tonight, basically. And I'm excited for you to go on that journey.
Muriel.
May I say something?
Oh, go ahead, George.
I don't recall who said it. I think it was Muriel regarding, I think something along the lines that Jung was becoming an idol. And I know for myself, Jung has become an idol, and at moments he remains an idol, and that's problematic. And I think that's inextricable with your question, Judy. How can all this material become less intellectual and much more existential? How can this material help me be a good person? Fight a good fight. To use a biblical terms. It seems to me that the Puer, one of the characteristics is narcissism. But the Puer, this perpetual adolescence. I'm not sure he's a child. I think for me the Puer is a 13, 14-year-old perennially seeking for identity. One of the terms is personae. And I think it was Shrikant that says that we live in a materialistic world. And for me, that has been engineered to diminish the depth psychology, the spiritual aspect. So it seems to me most of us are really persona-centric. And there's not a lot of material on that stuff. There's not. you know, but Jung does talk about being one-sided, you know, with this idea of inflation. But it seems to me that the earth is pregnant with puer, you know, both male and female. They're addicted to their personas. They're addicted to identities. I am this. You know, I am a father. I'm an American. I'm a good person. I'm a bad person. I'm an intellectual. I'm a researcher. I'm an academic. I'm a therapist. And we'll go on and on. But what I would submit to you, Judy, is start saying, I am not that. And perhaps that might take you somewhere existentially. You know, look at your narrative and start saying to yourself, I am not that. And I think that can be quite healing, because I do agree with that, what's been said. I think the puer is inextricable with a wound, with that first traumatic, that first psychic trauma. You know, that somehow we've been fixated and we went stuck. Our potential journey towards integrity, psychic integrity, was arrested at one point. You know, to say I am not that may take you in the direction. And as David said, you know, the rest is up to, at least I've understood David correctly. You know, it's up to you to sense the odors, you know, follow the trail. Anyway, I just want to somehow respond to Judy and to kind of contribute to the conversation. I think much of the puer has to do with our addiction to persona, you know, and it perpetuates adolescence. I mean, I look at our corporate leaders. I look at our political leaders. For me, they're arrested adolescents. They are puer, you know, and one of the ways that is facilitated is to engineer a materialistic culture, which it is okay, but I wish I live in a context where they could engineer an immaterial culture, you know, and perhaps that may compensate will compensate many of the ills we have today. Anyway, I just wanted to respond, or at least contribute.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Can I just jump in and build on what Jorge said?
Yep.
And throw it to the group here. And Muriel used the term end times. I think it is end time psychologically. Like, I don't see a lot of satisfaction out there. It's like we're really starting to spin our wheels, especially materially. And addiction-wise, it's just growing in different forms. And it's primarily because the levels we're talking about are demanding attention and connection. And that's only, we're like heading towards a psychosocial nervous breakdown. No amount of materialism, escapism, egoism is going to save us from our fate. And so we're just medicating ourselves. And Jung is like shaking his head going, there's the only escape out of it is this union with the divine. And so it's really weird to see like an entire culture and population. Like, we all have relatives and friends where you're like, I can't deal with them. They're just going to have to hit rock bottom. But what does a rock bottom culturally look like? It's sort of staggering when you think about it. So I'm just, you know, I think we are a puer culture. I agree with George 100%. We're addicted to our egos and our personas. And I think most people, they don't know any better. Okay. So to be fair, they don't know any better. And then when they do know, they're like, not going there.
Thank you. Muriel, you're next.
Yeah, lovely question, Judy, because it really brings us right into the lived reality. But yeah, how do you walk this into the world? And I so appreciate at the 11th hour you bringing that forward. And I agree with what has been said about what needs to happen. And I would, in terms of a question, I'd say, what are you paying attention to? Because what you are paying attention to on some level, you are worshiping. And so to have the self-reflection to say, you know, this is what's taking my time. And if it's your, you know, if it's your idiot device and you're just scrolling, then in that way, you are in fact making this the God, and that has to be sacrificed at some point. You know, I've found myself, I had to get off Twitter because Twitter was making everything so relevant and everything so immediate. And my husband said to me, like, you're changing in ways that I don't think is good for you, because it was like those things are programmed to take our souls. And so I think we have to say, what do we pay attention to? Because that, in fact, is what we are serving. So what is your highest value is what you give the most attention to. I remember in grade school, we had a teacher who said that if aliens came into our school, what would they believe our God was? And I was at a Catholic school. And so, you know, I'm thinking, well, there's a crucifix in every room. So that's our God, isn't it? And it's time. Time tells us when to eat. We all wear our own little watch. It's like the idea that what we pay attention to is our God. So the first part of the journey is to be self-reflective and, you know, look at your week. And so, like, I mean, even this will tell you how much screen time there's been, right? Or are you off in nature? Like, is that the place where you are giving your attention? Let it start there, because that will give you exactly what you need to know. If you're walking in the forest every day, as I try to, that will be your teacher. That things will be tossed along the path that will tell you what's next. So it doesn't have to be just through the books. It can be through the lived experience. So I would say trust that.
Thank
Can I
you.
ask a question on that? A thought like directly to that, what Muriel said, Shrikant?
Go ahead.
I'm wondering, Muriel, like how to apply that to a symbolic perspective. Like I think of like looking at material in such a way like where we turn our attention, but not just like a literal, like I'm spending this much time on Twitter, or I'm consumed by the news, or I'm angry about Trump, or I'm consumed by frustrations with my partner, right? Like, because we can look at the literal part of it. How do we start to transition into the symbolic? Like, it's a question, but I'll end with one example. Like the way I get to this sometimes is like when I think of someone being attractive, and I see them as attractive, and it's easy for me to think that person is attractive. Like they are attractive objectively, but the Jungian view has helped me realize, well, there's an image in me of what attractiveness is. And when that person is there, they correspond somewhat with the image inside of me. And therefore I find them attractive. There's a correspondence between their physical presentation and what's inside of me that attractiveness is. But until I make that distinction, I just could think, oh, that's just an attractive person, and relate to them as if I'm not involved. So how do we get to that place of paying attention, not just to what's around us, but turning it into a symbolic inquiry?
I mean, isn't that the ultimate question, right? It's like, because if we literalize it, as you say, that woman or that person I'm attracted to, if we literalize it, then we've lost the plot. But if we say that what is drawing my attention, what is drawing my libido, what is drawing my psychic energy, and using my psychic energy, I'm investing my energy or even my financial resources in that, then why is that sustainable? Or am I asking somebody else to carry the consequence of that for me, right? Like that's the puer. It's the idea that if you like you dedicate yourself to something and you try to find the meaning in that something that you've dedicated it to, and after years of dedication, you put that on the altar and you say, okay, that's the symbol of what is deeper than that. I think it is ultimately, and Jung said this, and even Freud said this at the end of his life, it's a spiritual journey.
Thank you. Thank you, Muriel. Judy, I have a suggestion, which is a very unusual suggestion, because I think it's all about kind of connecting to the core of you instead of the surface, instead of the things that you're obsessed with. And the best thing that I've actually found are these older wisdom tradition. In particular, I recommend Tao Te Ching. It's just 81 poems, beautiful poems, which you can listen to on YouTube in maybe about an hour or so. But they're so incredibly deep. And it's all about kind of, connecting to your center in so many different ways. It's beautifully, beautifully presented. So I would recommend that. Oh, excellent. Zach, you had a question. Zach with a new persona.
This is help me sleep so I don't have too much blue light coming in my eyes.
That's not Zach. That's I think that's Bono.
Oh, Bono, yeah. Sorry, Bono. Go ahead.
Okay, so I have two questions. One is kind of a silly question. The first question I thought of is some of these people who have read a lot of Jung, if you think Jung was a puer, or at least a puer at one point in his life. But then I guess my more serious question, I wanted to ask about the provisional life. It's something David mentioned a little bit, but we didn't spend too much time on this idea that the puer tends to think that, this somehow isn't quite real life. Like you're kind of waiting for real life to begin. And that kind of keeps the puer from really kind of committing and investing in relationships and the work. Yeah, it's an idea that I've heard before. I remember hearing an Alan Watts talk, and he was kind of, at least the way he was speaking about it, he was kind of saying this is how we all are. And kind of saying, oh, we all kind of have this idea that once I graduate high school, then life is going to begin. Oh, once I get into college, once I get my job, once I have this kid, there's kind of this perpetual feeling of this not being real life. I also think that John Lennon quote, I think he says like, life happens when we're busy making other plans, which is another kind of twist of this. But anyways, I'm curious what people think, if this is kind of connected to the puer specifically, or if this is more just a general thing, or I guess it could be that because our culture, as a lot of you have been saying, has become so kind of infiltrated with this puer syndrome that it is kind of a problem of the modern age, that we constantly feel that we're not quite, we're kind of waiting for life to begin.
Yeah, I mean, I love your questions, Zach. They really sort of go to the core of what I was talking about. Like I expanded the puer definition to not being connected to like those inner divine characters of spirit and soul. And so I define puer, which might not be the traditional, as you could sail through this provisional life. You could have a happy life, but you are not connecting to what you really are, the know thyself. And so ask people, when you just ask people, who do you think you are? What are you studying? It's sort of fascinating. Some of my smartest, most insightful friends, they're polite, but they sort of dismiss that question. Like, do you sit down they just sort of dismiss it. And I'm sort of stunned by that because, like I said, I live in fear of not knowing the answer to that question. And so I'm really caught off guard by people who are like, yeah, I'll pick up a book, or yeah, that's philosophy. And I'm stunned by, Aiden and I have talked about this before, people just not examining that question. And Jung was basically saying, yeah, we're on the Puer pathway. And to examine that question does take the work you're talking about. And most people don't do it because they're fearful. Like, if you spent most of your life with a worldview of yourself and the world, are you really going to change course? It usually happens when you're forced to, where things go so bad. It's what happened to me. I said I was in a dark forest. I didn't know where to go. So the default position for the human condition is awareness. Basically, it usually, very few people are going to have insight and do it voluntarily. You usually do it the hard way, which fascinated me because I didn't really know Jung's connection to helping with Alcoholics Anonymous. And, so many people who are in recovery programs, and Jung's in the background going, yes, because you're not doing the work to connect to this inner world. You're just miserable in your provisional life. And I see it. And one of the benefits of doing this talk, or maybe not, is now I see it so clearly. I see it in our entertainment. I see it in our politicians. I see it in people around me. I just see it. And I'm not saying, oh, they're doomed and having a horrible life. I almost feel a sympathy, or it's a tragedy. Like, are you just going to go through all this and not really connect with what you are? That, to me, not to sound judgmental, but that for me that's very sad. That's very sad.
David, I want to follow up by asking you a couple of questions because you made this point multiple times. I wanted to make sure I understand, everybody understands what you talked about, spirit and soul. Can you talk about what soul is and what spirit is?
So I don't have a typical Jungian definition of spirit and soul. It's a whole different conversation. However, like his old man symbol and his young woman symbol. So if you look on so many heroic archetypal journeys, there's always the old wise man and, the woman, the lady in the lake. So I want to leave it at those two symbols are archetypal and they reoccur over and over again. And the next sort of step after this talk is your question. I sort of want to leave it there.
I would love if you did one more talk, because I promise you will get, you just preparing for the talk, you will get as much. It's very, very deep thing. So, all right. Next up is going to be George. George, go ahead.
I have no idea if Jung ever resolved his puer. I don't think any of us do. I don't think any of us ever resolve in terms of a terminal, these psychic challenges. I mean, it's implied by if you strive for wholeness, you're going to be grappling with this and that, given circumstances. So I think it's again, existentially, it's an incessant challenge, and these configurations of energy, that we label as puer, I think is perennial. I used to teach teenagers, and I presently teach middle schoolers. And one of the things they always say is, I'm bored. Even when they're participating in something that they're passionate about, I'm bored. I forgot her name, one of the early ones. She talks about being lethargic, psychic energy being lethargic. How do you animate that? So I find that the puer is inextricably, connected with being boredom. How do we grapple with that? Well, I think in modern terms, they call addiction, right? Go shopping, work on a project, but like I like what David said. I think he's called it be conscious, be a conscious hero, right? I think that's what you call it. So how can I exercise my discernment from one moment to the next moment? Because when you don't animate that, I think you leave space for boredom. You leave space for this Jung talks about listlessness. There's non-action. It's problematic. And I think we live in a world that's pregnant with boredom. So once you're bored, you're able to be mesmerized by anything that sparkles. I mean, some people come to too many meetups. Go live your life. So be careful being addicted and looking for psychic nourishment. Jung talks about, being quenched at this magical well. I think Johnson opens it up, right, with his shadow book. That's Jung's, Jung. We're constantly looking for this fountain, this magic and fountain. And that fountain comes in the form of being a fanatic, in terms of sports or the arts, and there's nothing wrong with that. But how do you balance your life? How do you reflect and recall that the imperative is wholeness and is integrity? That's, I think, maybe fear is the right word, it's but I think fear can also motivate you. It can be quite motivating. But there are other virtues that we need to exercise. And for me, one of them is reflection. Be aware that you're bored. Because if you're not aware of you're bored, you will not become aware of that which is preoccupying you, whatever the task may be. So I hope that makes some sort of sense. I think, I don't think Jung was ever bored. However, that may speak much more of my ignorance of Jung. But from what I'm familiar with his narrative, I don't think he was ever bored. Even when he encountered his, when he was raped when he was a boy, when he had his heart attack when he was in 1944, I don't think he was ever bored. So, but perhaps I'm idolizing him.
Well, I just want to build on what George said about boredom. So I have a 7-year-old daughter. If you don't show something to her quickly, she's bored like that, and my wife and I are loath to put her on the video, especially on long trips. And we've discovered something really interesting, that if we tell her a story and she's a character in that story, we have her attention as long as we want. It was we were stuck in traffic on a car ride, and we were, she was melting down, and I just started making up a fairy tale where she was the star of the story. And I think that, to build on what George is saying, we get bored being bombarded by other people's stories, or someone imposing what they think should be our story. And so it's helpful to see yourself in a story or on a hero's journey. I think that if those people who think that way, they're on a hero's journey, life becomes a hero's journey. It becomes an adventure, what Campbell was talking about. And then if you're really committed to it in the work, what Campbell's saying is, in all these myths and stories from around the world. You're the central character, and it all leads collectively to the same treasure and the same goal. But what's funky is it's sort of like the culture gets, Aiden and I were talking about, the culture gets the hero's journey now. 100 years ago, people were like, what are you talking about? That's pretty much in our culture. Like, I go on this journey, but it's so superficial now. It's so superficial. It's so puer. Like, but at least we're on a hero's journey, but it's got to go to a real hero's journey. Like what we're talking about with Zach, and be like, no way, no, I'll escape to a hero's journey in a cinema or watching it. And I resonate with the importance of a journey. I can see myself on a journey. That's a sort of as far as we've gone. But when we come to that dark entrance and hear the dragon behind it, that's where the fear really kicks in, and people start medicating and escaping from that. So I don't know what you do. You just write off a giant part of the population going, that's what they're going to do. Some might go into that deep cave. But the key is to remind people it's your journey. Like I think that helps them with the boredom. Just riffing in the third hour here.
Thank you. Thank you. So David, I want to ask you a follow-up question, but I would just make a quick comment. I think though hero's journey is there in the culture, the version that is there is that of a tourist. Tourist version of the hero's journey, where you're just a spectator kind of going through this thing and you think you've done something, but you just kind of, it's just new experience. But the question I wanted to ask you, we've been talking about pure, and you started right off by saying, are you pure or are you a conscious hero? Can you talk for a little while about what a conscious hero is?
So when there's like hero and conscious hero. So hero is what we're talking about. It's everyone's a hero. Everyone's a superhero. Hero, hero, hero. You hear it all over the place. But are you truly a conscious hero? And what I meant by that term, and I'm glad you brought it up again, it's reaching a level of consciousness. For me, my definition, where you understand you have a heroic role to play with your spirit and soul.
Mm-hmm.
You have it's not the end of the journey, discovering anima and animus and their divinity. That's just the beginning. These are independent characters. They are very powerful. Think of all the temples throughout history where they had Aphrodite, or that was really projection of those inner divine characters, basically. So to me, being a conscious hero is I'm conscious of that heroic responsibility.
Wow. Okay, excellent. So folks, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. David, any closing thoughts?
It's like I said before, this has been great. I thank you for these meetups. Love to see my Jung homies in the house, because I don't feel like it's just my talk. I know Aiden, George, Muriel will be part of it. So it's great to see you guys here. And like I said, putting this together helped put a lot of pieces in place. So I'm very grateful for that. So thank you.
Thank you. I've found that, like, actually presenting something, you get a lot of value just from preparing for it, because it allows you to organize things, bring new things together. All right. Thank you very much. And Zach, great questions. Really appreciate that. Thank you. And take care, everybody. Bye.